Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
So what are we talking about this week, Chris?
Well, this one is one I've been really keen to do for a while. And I have, I was going to say a nerdy secret. I suspect I have many nerdy secrets that I don't share with people. But this is something I like to do. And I can't remember whether I've mentioned it in previous episodes, is to go visit the National Archives at Kew.
Yeah.
And so for those of you who don't know, or for those of your international listeners, the National Archives is a British archive of government-related documents which by law the government needs to keep and make available to the public. And while some documents that the government has to keep are considered secret, and they either don't let you see them for a period of time, or there are some that we will never get to see, there are all sorts of astounding documents. So, for example, censuses from 1542 you can go look at. You can go find out how many shillings Mistress Miggins had or anything like that. Or all the way through to some of the things that I'm doing this week is looking at reports around military operations that, in fact, we were just talking about before we came on. There's an operation called Operation Postmaster, which, if you have recently seen the film The Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare,
I have.
While that was a very exciting film with lots of people blowing things up, actually, and surprisingly, it was based on a real military operation in World War II. So I am going to go into Kew, I'm going to go look at these documents and actually read about the planning for these operations, what actually happened. And it's fascinating. And of course, the reason why I raised this for the podcast is because it's super interesting to understand the planning and the leadership that goes on behind some of these things that are very famous. And so today's episode is based on one of those things that I went to Kew and has been declassified. So you get to read secret documents and you can go read them a little bit later.
Interesting.
So that's the warm-up I've given you.
Okay. Well, I think it's worth sort of talking about the fact that I happened to be giving a talk at a wealth managers conference yesterday.
You hobnobber.
And absolutely. And one of the points I was making in my talk was about how we create insight and then ultimately foresight. So insight is understanding what's going on, foresight, how you then turn that into understanding what might happen next, the art of prediction. And I think the key point I was trying to make is prediction is not about prophecy. No one has a crystal ball. We can't tell what the future is going to be. But it is absolutely about understanding trends and then starting to think about whether those trends are likely to continue. And I think I've mentioned on the podcast before the idea of a cone of plausibility, sort of this idea that if you start now and look forward into the future, the further out you go, the more the possibility and the range of possible futures diverges. So it becomes this cone of possibility. And within that, you want to think about what is probable, what is plausible, what is possible. And with all good red teaming and scenario planning and strategic planning, you want to be thinking about what is the best case scenario, what is likely to happen, what you want to happen, but also those worst case scenario situations, those wildcards. What's really interesting about people who are good at prediction is how much they reflect back on decisions that were made in the past and then look to the present about predictions that were made and how right or wrong people were. The way you get good at prediction is not to keep doing it and just hope, and it's not to be an expert in the subject that you're predicting about. It's to reflect on how you and others thought about the future back in the past, when the future is now the present. And so I think whilst history is not a blueprint for how to do things, there are lessons in history that are really, really important. And I don't think we make enough use of things like the National Archives.
Well, and I want to pick up on that because I think naturally, to some degree, we glamorize the idea of imagining what the future might look like. we prognosticate what we can imagine. And in a minute, I'm going to give you a scenario of what might happen in the future. But the bit that I really want to dig into today is the mundane planning that has to go in, because the risk is we say, well, of course, the future is unknowable. This might happen, that might happen, even to the point of, well, this is likely or unlikely. The point is, at some point, somebody has to say, we need to pick a plan, and the plan needs to be detailed enough. So actually, before we get into my National Archives, and it came up again, I saw it on the news this morning, I want to talk about COVID very briefly, because I think COVID is a fantastic example of what I'm trying to get to. And that is the fact that the COVID report, the final COVID report was published just before Christmas, I believe.
Yeah.
And we'll go into that in a second. This is something that touched everyone.
Yeah.
I personally lived in a static caravan for, I think it was 9 months under lockdown. So literally every single person in the country was affected by this, not just in terms of they had to stay in the house, but how did you get petrol for your cars? How did you get your food? It was so fundamental. And what was really interesting, and I haven't done it, but this is on my list of things to do, is the report was absolutely fascinating and went into a huge amount of detail. And I fear we saw what was on the television of a few of our politicians because that was newsworthy.
Yeah.
What we missed was perhaps some of the fundamental recommendations and understandings. So the report revealed that the government's planning before the pandemic was, quote, deeply inadequate, with major failures in both preparedness and decision-making. And they concluded that the officials overestimated the nation's readiness and relied on misleading assurances, ultimately responding too slowly and at an enormous human cost. And the assumption is that with proper planning and decision-making, potentially we could have saved 23,000 lives.
Yeah. And I think what's really important is clearly there is an element of these inquiries creating some element of closure for people who suffered through loss of loved ones or loss of business or whatever. So there is an element of trying to find and hold people to account. But more importantly, it's about learning how we can do things better. And where the COVID is a really, really good example of, or pandemics generally, of where really, really detailed maths, probabilities, and exponentials meets psychology and sociology and politics. And I think learning the lessons from how we handled or mishandled the COVID pandemic is going to be incredibly difficult, because in the report will be really clear recommendations that now seem like they're not relevant. But of course they are relevant, because this is all about the black swan events, the things that are low probability but high impact. And I suspect there will be lots of things in this report that say we were underprepared because we didn't take the threat seriously.
I think that's absolutely right. And this is me waving the flag for good planning, good leadership, and good management. And this is the really dull stuff.
Yeah.
This is the stuff where someone says, today we should practice this. And someone says, I'm really busy.
Yeah.
It's really expensive and it's never going to happen. And then when it does happen, everyone looks slightly shifty and says, well, how could we have known it was going to happen?
Yeah.
There's a plan that says it's going to happen at some point, what to do.
And I think from a political sense, no one wins votes by utilising national resource for something that probably isn't going to happen. In a business, the same is true.
100%.
No one wants to spend money on the thing that probably won't happen. But when it does happen, because these are high impact, by God, you wish you had. And this is why insurance exists. And what I'm seeing quite a lot in my work at the moment is exactly this complacency, not around pandemics, but around cyber attacks, and companies taking really tangible risk on things that they just don't think are going to happen to them. and it's somebody else's
Well,
problem.
and that beautifully, I've written quite a lot of notes for this, and that was exactly the sentence I said, which is, it's easy to say, well, of course, it was politicians that screwed up COVID, but exactly as you say, I want people to think about their own organizations and whether they've planned for these things. And I just want to call out a number of bullets from the report, not because I want to spend a huge amount of time on COVID, but because I think these things probably talk about generic failures in planning and the kinds of things people get wrong. So the report called for sweeping reforms to pandemic response structures and culture. And by the way, I feel terrible saying this. I would imagine in a year or so, everyone will have forgotten this and moved on, which is inevitably what happens. But they suggested we should simplify and clarify crisis management structures, reducing bureaucracy and streamlining lines of authority.
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with COVID. That says, in a complex organization or a complex situation, how will we deal with it? What groups of people will deal with it? That's the first one. Number two, enhance rapid and reliable data gathering, sharing and analysis, and run regular pandemic exercise every 3 years. Again, the first part of it, enhance rapid and reliable data gathering. How are you going to know something is happening, irrespective of whether it's COVID? Improve communications with the public, ensuring laws and guidance are understandable, and scrutinize emergency powers more carefully. If something is happening in a business or organization, how do you tell people what is going on and what they should do? Foster constructive partnership across all UK nations and with international partners for joined up consistent actions. It may not just be you that's affected by this. How do you work with others? Routinely use red teams. I won't even go and finish the end of that because you've heard us talk about it. And if you haven't, please go back and listen to multiple episodes. We've talked about red teaming. Establish and regularly review independent oversight to ensure preparedness is continually improved. I think this is brilliantly done. This says, be really careful that the people in charge of preparedness don't become complacent. Who tests? The people who test preparedness.
And it comes back to, my point about no one wins votes. So if you have an independent oversight authority, it holds politicians to account. And the red teaming is really, really useful. We talk a lot on this podcast about red teaming so that you can gain insight and so you can stress test and all of those brilliant things. In this case, what it also does is it generates a body of evidence to say where you are or you're not prepared. And once there is evidence to say we've done a war game around a flu pandemic, and it turned out the government's not prepared, well, if there's a flu pandemic and somebody digs out that report and says, you did a war game 6 months before and the recommendations all said do this, this and this, and you didn't do any of it, well, suddenly you're now a lot more vulnerable as a politician being held to account. So the red teaming in this sense, not only does it expose where you're weak and fragile and need to, invest in building resilience, but it also creates a body of evidence that can be used to hold you to account for not doing that.
And I mean, this is such a broad set of topics we can discuss. This isn't me secretly trying to bash the government and saying they're idiots.
No, not at all.
I think there were obvious cases of incompetence and fraud and all those kinds of things you would expect in most cases. The point I really want to make is these things are can be enormously important.
Yeah.
And to plan, even if you have a highly competent group of people, is incredibly hard.
Yeah.
So anyway, we've talked a bit about COVID, and I urge people to go back and look at the report, partly because, we were all a part of the COVID response, for good or bad, but also just in terms of looking at how a country organized itself, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so, to appreciate the complexity and difficulty of managing something at this scale. And while organizations probably won't need to face something at this scale, the principles are highly relevant. Which
absolutely.
So that was what I wanted to do about COVID.
What I would say is just to round that off is your point is really well said, that this isn't an attack on a particular government or a particular, actually there were some really, really good things as well. And we can learn lessons from what went well just as much as from what went badly. This is not an attack on a particular government because of their lack of ability. This is inherent in bureaucracies, their natural tendency to not understand exponentials and to deprioritize low probability, high impact things over high probability, low to medium impact. And this is why, governments repeatedly don't invest in defence, increasing security risks, which we know over time costs us more. Avoiding conflict by having strong defence and security apparatus is far cheaper in the long run than making what we call peace dividends and then finding ourselves in a situation where global security is reduced and we have to ramp up quickly. Or worse, we end up in a conflict, which is extraordinarily expensive to a nation. So I think it's really important to recognise that this isn't, and the COVID inquiry is not a singular review of a particular government. It is, most of the recommendations are relevant and pertinent to all organisations. It's about how do you manage to balance prioritisation of things that are intangible, are uncertain, and have ambiguity built in.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. Let's take a super quick break. And when we come back, I'm going to tell you a made up story. It's like story
Excellent.
time. Welcome back. So before the break, we queued up this idea of the complexity of planning for a black swan event, but really any kind of event and the necessity of planning. I am now going to tell you, and I want to be very clear, a completely made up story that will not bear any resemblance to anything we see today in the world, because otherwise that would be ridiculous and it wouldn't work in a podcast. So, and I, by the way, I wrote these notes originally back around the Christmas time. And so as I read this, I have already realized how ridiculous the things I've said are in terms of this could never happen. So please bear that in mind as we go. So the reality is, over the last 80 years, as Europeans, we have not truly experienced war, and certainly what I mean is in Central
Western
Europe, Central Europe, and particularly the United Kingdom. We've participated in wars, but of course they were always far away: Iraq, Afghanistan, and Ukraine even. And obviously, before I wrote this, I hadn't thought about Iran. But Iran is far away and is another one of these television wars where we get to see distant explosions and people talking about things. And this is really, really important, I think. And it goes to your point about Black Swan and whether organizations plan for things. These were other people's wars. They still are other people's wars, and they've never really impacted day-to-day life in the UK. They just haven't. If we're really honest, a bomb has not exploded in London, and so therefore it hasn't impacted us. And I will remind you, because every now and then we are slightly political, in 2021, the wise military general-like leader of our country, Boris Johnson, said, and I quote, "We have to recognise the old concepts of fighting big tank battles on European land masses are over, and there are other better things we should be investing in, FCAS and the Future Combat Air System in cyber, because this is how warfare in the future is going to be." And obviously that was just before thousands and thousands of tanks were used in. So the point being is, it's somebody else's war. And we're not very good at even thinking what war looks like. So now I want to paint a scenario which was honestly a few years ago would have been considered unthinkable, but today there is a non-zero chance that something like this could happen. And it starts with an old man feeling threatened. That's not me, although I do sometimes feel threatened. Mr. Putin, Vladimir Putin, realizes that his failure to defeat Ukraine, like the proverbial boiling frog, has slowly and imperceptibly led to the weakening of Russia and, more importantly, his hold on power. Whether we like it or not, he lives day by day on this. I think
Yeah.
it's fair to say if the Ukraine war fails for Russia, he will fail, and there is a pretty fair chance he will be ejected
Yeah.
and in the Russian way be found hanging or fell out of a window or something like that. So at some point, others within Russia are going to take that power away from him and install themselves as leader. However, as a KGB man, and there is some fascinating stuff that has been done about his background and why he thinks the way he thinks, he knows the best defense is an offense. And so in this scenario, and again, it's a non-zero chance in this scenario, he decides to do something that everyone else would describe as insane. With his weakened resources, but backed by a nuclear arsenal, he decides he's going to pick another fight. He instructs his military to conduct a snap invasion of the Baltic states. Understandably, as members of NATO, this triggers global alarm. The Russians are now in Baltic states, and NATO scrambles to respond. Russian paratroopers and armoured columns stream across the border into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And again, if people think I'm talking like a crazy man, there are many NATO plans that assume this very thing will happen and what we would do. But they overwhelm local defences, and within hours, while sabotage teams target strategic, I can't say the word strategic, it's too early in the morning, strategic infrastructure and communications across Europe, NATO partners, including the UK, activate rapid reaction plans, deploying air, naval and ground assets. And in Putin's words, NATO is escalating the situation to a point where Moscow has to react. And react means missile strikes and cyber attacks from Eastern European to Western capitals. And again, this idea of Russian missiles raining down in Western capitals seems insane and impossible, except this week, Iranian missiles have been landing in Dubai. We would consider that missiles landing in London to be impossible.
Yeah.
It is not impossible.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that are worth kind of pointing out here. And one is we started by talking about other people's wars and Iran, the current situation, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, all of these sort of conflicts. Almost everybody in society has not lived through the existential crisis of war in the homeland or a threat to the homeland. We're very lucky geographically in the UK that we live on an island on the western fringe of Europe. So even during the First and Second World War, we weren't digging trenches and fighting land battles on UK British soil. But there were bombing raids, there were attacks, there were threats of insurgency, there were spies, and we were sending obviously vast amounts of British blood and treasure to go and defend other parts of Western Europe. We have forgotten all of that. We now have got to a point where we talk about war as if it's a choice. The other thing that's worth thinking about is the development in technologies since the last time we had to think about an attack on the homeland, which is the ability for precision strike with relatively cheap long-range effectors. And that used to be ballistic missiles. We're now moving into an age of things like hypersonic missiles and advanced cruise missiles, as well as, and we're seeing this in Iran at the moment, the Iranian-made Shaheds, which are made under license in Russia.
$20,000 a Shahed or $40,000?
The price comes down every time I read about it, but yeah, we're talking low tens of thousands of dollars. The Russians are making the Geran 2, which is a Shahed made under license, and they're producing hundreds a day. These have ranges of up to 1,200 kilometers, and they're really cheap. With quite large warheads, I think you can get up to about 50, 60 kilos into a Shahed. And that means that you don't need squadrons of bombers. The Blitz in the Second World War, was quite an organisational undertaking, and the Battle of Britain, the use of British fighter squadrons to defend the skies over southeast England, was a big operation. I think what we're talking about now is so much smaller and so much cheaper that this could happen really, really quickly. And your example of Dubai is a really good example of a decision made by the US administration to launch Operation Epic Fury, which I'm still not convinced by the name, but let's move on. Led to, as you say, missiles and drones attacking right across the Middle East, areas that 24 hours earlier were holiday destinations. Just shows the speed at which this can change.
So going back to my scenario, within the first 72 hours, things are starting to get real. We've deployed F-35s to protect Baltic airspace and attack incoming Russian aircraft. Special forces are trying to secure ports and airfields, but now the war is coming to the UK. To everyone's surprise, and it was a surprise in this scenario, Russian missiles strike RAF bases in England and Scotland, including the one we are sitting just opposite. Heavy casualties, damaged runways, and all of a sudden fighters have to operate from hardened shelters, dispersed airfields, or overseas air stations. There are missile strikes hitting power stations in the UK that lead to power blackouts and major civilian casualties. The Royal Navy is attacked in the North Sea. We suffer losses. Ships are sunk. Russian armoured units push west. British casualties mount. On the home front, and this is what I want to really get to and focus on here, rather than this being a purely military discussion, there is mass mobilization. We are now at war. There is an existential threat to the United Kingdom. Reservist and volunteer units are called up. Government enacts emergency powers, and thousands are now sheltering from air raid threats in city, including London. Disrupted transport, cyber attacks on financial networks, sabotage at energy sites. There's now rationing in the UK. There's the closure of public venues, martial law in key regions, schools are closed, ships are requisitioned, railways are now commandeered for military use. There's the no daily commute because now they need to move troops around. And all of this has happened in less than a week. Now, that clearly is, well, you can tell I've heavily borrowed from one of the episodes we did called The War Game. And if you haven't listened to it, please go back and listen to it. It is fascinating. But the reason why I wrote it in such detail is I want to make the point, this is beyond anything we had imagined and anything we are prepared for in the United Kingdom.
Yeah.
Now, before I now say, and what would the government do it? But the whole point about this is, why have I painted this picture? You only have to ask the people and government of Ukraine whether they thought that they would be facing an existential war. And while these things are unlikely, as you have said, with black swans, they do happen. And when they do happen, they're going to affect literally everybody in the country. Now, wind back the clock to my scenario, and at the start of that 2 weeks when the attacks happened, we would assume the military would have planned for these kinds of activities. They've practiced. So to some degree, the military know what they're doing. And as I say, this is less about what the military are doing. They will have plans for moving troops to a certain place, counterattacking, whatever it might be. That's the military. But now we get to the real meat of this. How does the Prime Minister know what to do? Because Keir Starmer has never fought a war.
Yeah.
Never mind the Prime Minister. How does the Cabinet Secretary, who is also effectively, a member of the civil service, how does he advise the Prime Minister on what to do? Because the Cabinet Secretary says, well, Prime Minister, this is what we have to do. How does the Chief Constable of all the police authorities know what his police should be doing when the missiles are landing? You can't make this stuff up. You have to know. Which foreign agents do you need to arrest? Who do you go out and pick up because they could be foreign agents? Never mind the police. What about the harbour authorities? Because, you have to think about what to do with ships. The Civil Aviation Authority, we talk about them in terms of Heathrow machines not running, the X-ray machines not running quick enough. they have to stop aeroplanes flying.
Mm.
Where are they going to put the aeroplanes? What are they going to do with the aeroplanes? The Minister for Education, who's going to say stop schools?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you can see these ripples for this is not just something that three people at the top have to work out. If a country has to protect against this kind of black swan event, a major world war, you can't just make it up as you go. And I think COVID, the reason why I talked all about COVID was COVID, it showed you an example of when there was a plan and how weak that plan, arguably, elements of that plan turned out to be. Now imagine it's war. So now I've built up the tension. A country with no plans or a country with a plan, there's your question.
Yeah. So I would push back slightly, and I would say, firstly, in terms of the scenario, these are really useful for having these discussions. But as I said at the very beginning, there's no way of predicting the future of some sort of prophecy. So this is about generating the discussion to say, as you said, what is the role of a harbour authority? What is the civil aviation authority? And having these discussions. And you would hope that somewhere in government, these are discussions and war games.
I like your word, you would hope.
That are happening.
That someone else, that another department.
But I would also say, remember what we said before about planning and how much you need to plan and construct and create the detail and how much you need to create the culture. And I would say more important is not, does everybody know what their job is to do when the missiles come? They're going to dust off their in case of war orders. And actually, it's more a case of, have we got a resilient culture that if overnight there is some black swan event, it might be a war, it might be another pandemic, it might be a dirty bomb goes off in London because of a terrorist attack. I don't know. It could be another economic meltdown. Whatever the systemic shock is that changes everybody's life overnight, how resilient as a culture are we? So there's a lot of conversation now about if there was mass mobilisation. So I'm less interested in how does that technically work? Who's got the lists? How do we cascade out to make sure that we can recruit all the right people? Where are they trained? There's a whole load of logistics that actually that could be worked out. The more important question is, psychologically, are we ready? Are people ready to step up? And so I think there's something in this about generating the right discussions to start to ask what we need to do now to prepare versus do we know exactly what we're going to do?
Well, I'm going to push back on your pushback because I think it has to be a combination of the two. And actually, I'll probably flash a bit on this and be quite passionate. We've got too many people saying, don't worry, it would be fine. We have a culture of agility and flexibility. I think, and luckily I'm slightly backed up by this, you should have a freaking plan. You should have a plan. Now, without the culture of agility and without the culture of resilience, I completely agree a plan is useless. But there was a plan for COVID and it was partially successful.
Yeah.
It could have been a better plan. And in fact, rather than argue about whether it's one or another, I suspect we could agree it's both.
Oh, absolutely.
And actually, the point about this, which is, and this has sort of been the whole of the first episode, is this is actually the concept of something called the government war book.
Yeah.
And I think this is absolutely fascinating. So as early as the 1930s and continuing up and including the Cold War, in fact, I've got this in my notes, I think it's up to as late as 2003, the United Kingdom had a thing which was actively updated called the government war book.
Yeah.
And some of you may have heard of the government war book, but I suspect many of you have not, because it was a top secret set of instructions and plans to direct the actions of government officials in the event of war. Now, it was particularly important post-1945, where the chances of a nuclear conflict were sufficiently high that they needed to have some plans. And the purpose was to outline every step the government would take from the period of heightened tensions through to the outbreak of hostilities. And to your point, and I think this is probably where we meet in the middle, the important thing was in periods of time where you have time to think about this, they thought very carefully about all the things they would need to do and at a high level when they would need to do them. The actual plans, I am sure, would evolve as you went through, but not talking to the CAA and saying, okay, CAA, if there is a major conflict in the UK, 1,000 Shahed drones come to London, if they don't talk to someone and say, you need to have a plan, there's going to be an awkward, or give us a couple of weeks.
Yeah,
we'll come up with a plan. So it's that balance in the middle, which was fascinating.
And we've talked in the past, and there's, the famous Eisenhower quote of, all plans are useless, but planning is indispensable.
100%.
We know that there's no point having a plan that goes to the nth degree in detail, because what you end up doing is becoming precisely inaccurate because you can't predict the future.
And we'll talk about that with the war book as well, because it's very.
But what you can do is have those high level discussions to say who needs to be delegated the authority that if and when the events change, they can be given the resources for them to plan.
Well, and even more so, there'll be some really interesting examples where there are some things that they know they will need to do, and those things are complex things.
Yes.
And so they will have plans to have thought about those complex things. And I'll give you one example, because we're just about to finish this episode, almost as a teaser for the next episode. In case of nuclear war, all radio stations were to be shut down, bar the BBC, and the BBC would transmit on all frequencies. Okay, that's a really interesting example, which is, rightly or wrongly, the government said we need to be the people communicating with the populace. Someone has to know when to turn off all the other radio stations, and someone has to know what switches do we need to pull, what wires do we need to connect for the BBC to be the radio service that you will hear. Likewise, okay, if the BBC radio service now has to be transmitting in time of war, where will they be transmitting from? Who will be transmitting? So there's a really good example which, thinking about this, you might change it. You might say it turns out we're not going to stop all the other radio stations because we need Magic FM in times of need. But without those plans, someone has to go, well, there's no way for us to switch all these other radio stations off. So fascinating. Anyway, I'm just before we sort of finish this episode and round it off, I wanted to give you just this sense as a teaser almost on some of the things that are in this war book. And in the next episode, we'll go into a bit more detail because they are absolutely fascinating about planning. So they talk about mobilization and emergencies, detailed procedures for calling up reservists, as you would expect, introducing food stockpiles and rationing. Oh, shit, if we're at war, there's not going to be the regular incoming food in containers. What do we do? Mobilizing emergency services, rounding up dissidents. It's specified, get this is what really, really made me interested in this. Someone had really, really thought about this. If there is a Third World War, if there is a nuclear war, particularly in this case, there may not be enough people to do the work. And so they had plans for which prisoners could be released from prisons on license to address potential workforce shortages or emergencies. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
No one would think about that, but someone has thought, well, we know how the world works. We'll need to think about these things. Regional government. In the event of nuclear war, Parliament would effectively suspend itself. They had plans for that. Power would shift to regional commissioners, which would be government ministers, with absolute control over subdivided regions of the UK. And these officials would be granted sweeping powers, including life and death powers. They were going to be told, you can execute people for these following activities. Again, and we can debate whether this is a good or a bad thing, but some people sat down
But they
and said,
thought about it.
we've really, really thought about it. I've got some amazing examples later. Cabinet dispersal and continuity. So our government, as we understand them today, our central government, the leaders would disperse to emergency sites and nuclear bunkers from which an alternative system of local, regional and national government would operate. Operations and intelligence centres would coordinate civil defence, communications and reinforce essential services. Think about that. An entirely new government organisation they're planning for. Two more. Command and retaliation. Procedures established for the Prime Minister or an appointed successor, which is very creepy words for the Prime Minister is dead, to retain control of the UK's nuclear deterrent and order retaliation if necessary. I'm going to give you one of the stories that I was going to tell a little bit later, but just to sort of tease this. The government realised in this war book, which, as again, to reiterate, was top secret, and there's this interesting idea of when do you tell people and what do you tell people, should, at the commencement of these war, the Prime Minister would nominate two people in his cabinet who didn't know until that point, who would have the ability to launch nuclear weapons, assuming the Prime Minister was dead. So, literally, I think there is a possibility of nuclear war. The cabinet secretary would come to the Prime Minister and say, which two people will you nominate? And this wouldn't have been briefed to the cabinet, by the way. And there would be a letter that the Prime Minister would sign that would officially delegate power to and would be handed to this poor minister saying, congratulations, you are now
finger on the button.
You are the finger on the button. They were so prepared for this, they had drafted a blank piece of paper with the words written and the headed note paper. So all they had to do in time of war was write the name of the minister in the top by hand and have the Prime Minister sign it at the bottom. They had even prepared to say, we don't have time to say where's the typewriter or the printer. We don't have time to say what are we going to say. They drafted all of this. That's fascinating. Absolute emergency powers. There's legislation which still exists and royal warrants which have been pre-signed by the monarch for rapid activation that would grant cabinet ministers exceptional powers for the duration of the emergency. So the war book, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, was absolutely comprehensive in coverage from this transition from peace to war. And here's a thing to finish on from me, notably, and this is very Cold War, did not include any post-strike recovery or reconstruction. It said, how do we fight the war?
Not what do we do afterward?
We're not going to get to the point of what do we do afterwards. So that is the war book that we're going to talk about in the next episode.
So there's a couple of things that are really interesting there. One, I think you have to consider that this is 1945 onward. So this is a generation of people who have just fought an existential war, who have mobilized the state. And so I think their experience and their mindset is probably, they're in a better position to be able to think through what would be required. There was a couple of things that you talked about as you've sort of gone through your initial scenario of the Third World War, but also talking about the war book. One of which was Civil Aviation Authority and what is their responsibility for grounding planes, etc. And the other one was the BBC shutting down radio stations and becoming the sole voice of communication. Those don't work in the 21st century.
You hold that thought.
Yeah, well,
that's a thing.
We'll go into the details in the next episode, but it's worth recognising that these plans, these kind of ideas, need to be continually updated.
Absolutely.
As we recognise how the world has changed. We don't really use conventional radio stations in the same way. Everything is now IP based. We could set up a radio. Well, we do a podcast.
This is, I mean, you're, as they say, cheese sandwiching what I've got in the future, which is exactly that. So This is not going to be an exercise in trying to critique the war book. Actually, the war book in itself is fascinating.
Yeah.
I think it reveals things that we have lived in that we did not understand was happening behind the scenes. That in itself is fascinating enough. And you're going to hear me talk about the Civil Aviation Authority. Spoiler alert, it's not just about landing planes at Heathrow. I'll tell you what the Civil Aviation Authority was geared to do. But to your second point, and we'll talk about this, I'm sure, which is in 2000, in the late 90s and then in the early 2000s, we stopped the war book.
Yeah.
And we stopped the war book. Again, there's an interesting discussion, I think, for foolish reasons. I think we had forgotten why we built the war book in the first place. And by the way, just to correct you, the war book didn't start in 1945. The war book started, I think it was the early 30s, because they saw what was coming.
Yeah, sure.
But to your point, there's a fascinating conversation, and that's one of the things I wanted to sort of finish with in a couple of episodes was, how would it be different this time?
Yeah.
Because to your point, and again, it goes back to your point about how far do you plan ahead? How detailed should your plans be? You need room to evolve. But if I was doing the war book today, as you have said, that is an entirely valid question. How do people get their news today? If you subscribe to the principle that in case of total war, it is important for the government to be the sole communication, I'm sure there'll be people debating that. How does the government become the sole method of communication in a world where... So fascinating. Let's finish it for now, but we'll come back in the next episode. And I just want to have some fun. This is all in the National Archives. I actually went away, I think it's 600 pages, the last war book, which was the 1980s war book that has been declassified. Fascinating. And I want to just pick a couple of examples out there and talk about why they're so fascinating, not just because this was what was happening behind the scenes, because I think it talks about people who have spent a bit of time thinking, what would we do? And the importance of that red teaming. Because I think today, if you said to a business, think about a black swan activity, I don't think they'd be very good at imagining what that looks like. Whereas I think we have here 50, 60, 70 years of people with experience and thinking about it, which is really good. So let's call it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this. We haven't done an awful lot on the war book yet. It was more lining it up. There was a little bit of difference of opinion there, which will be interesting to see how we go.
No, I don't think there was, actually. I think we agreed that you need to plan.
It's good for podcasts if we disagree. People like
and I think we agreed that you also need to think about the organisation that you're planning for and with. And I think we agreed eventually that your plan can't be so detailed that it's going to be wrong, and therefore that you have to find somewhere that balance of, we've got a plan, we know this isn't going to be the plan, but it's the framework from which we can then actually work out the detail based on the context at the time. And I think that seems more logical than going down into, the nth degree nuanced detail of, what are you doing? What is this particular? So there is there's a balance, isn't there, of how much detail you plan into.
Well, and let's come back and do that in the next episode. Otherwise, we'll just talk for hours rather than sort of break down to chunks.
Absolutely.
I hope you've enjoyed this. This is, I think, a fascinating example of our own history, but also about how people think about things. If this is interesting to you, let us know. Or if it's not interesting to you, let us know. We're on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We are on Twitter and Blue Sky @battlingwithbiz. Like and subscribe, all that kind of like and subscribe stuff that you're supposed to say. But if you do like this, it helps the algorithms find us and helps other people find Battling with Business. But thank you for joining us on this first episode about the war book. And we will join you again next week, where we go into a little bit more detail and touch more on some of those things that we've talked about this episode.
Excellent.
See you next week.
All right. See you later.
Bye-bye.